to a specific plot of land, although they may be tied to a specific plot of land. But on the whole, they tend not to be tied so much to a specific plot of land, a specific mountain, or a specific locality, as they are tied to a people and to a set of shared experiences, collective memories. In this respect, place in the mountains is a metaphor, or at least a component of community. If community is to be defined also not as a physical neighborhood, a place with specific boundaries, but as a set of persisting relationships and responsibilities which bind people together. And what I'm arguing here is that we view community in anthropologic terms rather than as a physical locality with clearly defined borders. We need to understand community and therefore place as a set of human relationships which have associated with them certain value assumptions, certain responsibilities, as I'm going to point out in a minute, within a larger human context. Now, it is this loss of identification with place, with the feeling of community, that has been expressed by so many contemporary Americans, especially in recent years, who have come to feel atomized and powerless in modern mass society. Over the last certainly 25 years, I've done some reading which even extends it farther back, we see a continual history of struggle, at least in American society, over the problems of modernization, the emphasis upon the individual that saps, in many cases, meaning and purpose from our lives. Such diverse writers in recent years as Simone Weil, Christopher Lasch, Peter Berger, Wendell Berry, a host of others, have lamented the individualizing tendencies of modern culture and have called for a revival of the mediating structures that bind our societies together. The roots phenomena, I think, of the 1970s reflected as much a desire for connections as it did a desire to regain an understanding and to rediscover our ancestors. And recently, Robert Bella and his associates have renewed this national debate with their best-selling book, Habits of the Heart. Politically, conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats in recent years have joined the call for the rebuilding of American communities as an essential part of the rebuilding of America as a whole. Now, we in Appalachian Studies should be doubly interested in this debate, since the search for community has been central to our work in the region for many, many years. Certainly no theme has been stronger in our literature than the effort to understand the Appalachian character and to explain the nature of the mountain community. Certainly no aspect of mountain life has been so frequently studied. And yet, as so much is the case with the Appalachian region, so frequently misunderstood and maligned as the fundamental nature of the mountain community. In fact, for over 100 years, observers of mountain life have denied the existence of community altogether in the region. Examples: Emma Bell Miles, who was otherwise a rather receptive observer, wrote in 1905 that, quote, "There is no such thing as a community of mountaineers. They are knit together man to man as friends, but not as a body of men." Writers from time to the present, including Horace Keppert, Samuel Wilson, James Raine, Jack Weller, Rupert Vance, Thomas Ford, and many others, have continued that traditional view. Jack Weller summarized the attitudes of most when he wrote in 1965 that the mountains, quote, "have no community life as such or life outside their very limited fan group. They are virtually impossible to organize into groups and are traditionalistic to the extreme. Given this perceived absence of community, John C. Campbell concluded that the dominant trait of the mountaineer was independence. Independence raised to the fourth power, he said. Heredity and environment have conspired to make him an extreme individualist. Campbell devoted an entire chapter in his classic book to the individualism of the Southern Highlanders, and almost every writer since has found individualism to be one of the most powerful determinants of the mountain character. According to the received literature, the mountaineer is the extreme individualist who cares nothing for cooperation and has no commitment to community beyond what he can get out of it for himself. This notion of mountain individualism has provided grist for the theoretical mill of those who would see the region in negative terms, as uncivilized, backward, barbaric, and degenerate. It's become the popular symbol of the mountaineer in cartoons and the media, and has been used to explain everything from labor violence to stream pollution. In fact, the origins of this individualistic image are deeply rooted in the idea of Appalachia itself and lie entwined in the work of turn-of-the-century progressive writers who associated individualism with the passing of the frontier and community with the progressive and civilizing forces of modern and urban life. Campbell, for example, drew his accounts of the early history of Appalachia from the work of Theodore Roosevelt and Frederick Jackson Turner, men who believed that the frontier had been an individualizing experience, one which had given rise to the great independent spirit of American democracy. The progressive generation of the turn of the century was one that was convinced that the frontier experience was one of chaos, was one of an individual struggling against nature, and that progressive urban civilized life would bring order to chaos. This search for order permeated much of the political environment of the turn of the century in American society. I believe that many of the assumptions of this generation were wrapped up in much of the way we initially began to see and understand the Appalachian community. More recent historians, however, have all but turned the frontier thesis on its head and have pointed to the persistence of community in the West movement rather than to settlement by individual pioneers. Far from being extreme individualists forced to adapt to a harsh environment, the early frontiersmen were more likely to be part of an extended community of interdependent families. And by practicing communal and cooperative efforts, they were able not only to survive, but to flourish. Contemporary scholars associate the rise of individualism, in fact, with the growth of capitalism and modernization, not with the persistence of the frontier. Unfortunately, this scholarship has had little effect upon Appalachian studies, and the communal heritage in the mountain character has all been lost to our collective memory. Many of us in recent years have been uncomfortable with this conventional notion of individualism and have pointed to countervailing themes, cooperation and commitment in the region's history. We've been convinced that the family and the community are important institutions in the mountains, institutions which have been under assault from the forces of modernization and technology. But we have been so caught up in studying the political and economic consequences of modernization and deriving lessons from our past that we have neglected to understand the nature of the mountain community itself, and within it the role that place plays in that community. In a sense, it's not only the political lessons from our past that we need to identify and apply to the present, but also the elements of our cultural traditions, our communal heritage, that we need to understand if we are to sustain our regional identity. Let me give you a couple of examples of recent research that I believe is beginning to point in a new direction. One manuscript of a book which is not out yet that I think does a superb job with reinterpreting this earlier part of Appalachian tradition is one by Professor Durwood Dunn, who teaches at Tennessee Wesleyan. Durwood happens to be here with us today. Durwood has a new book coming out from the University of Tennessee Press entitled Cades Cove, The Life and Death of a Southern Appalachian Community. Just a little bit of background on Cades Cove. Some of you may know that Cades Cove is sort of under the lip of the Great Smoky Mountains in East Tennessee. The Park Service has sort of recreated a community in Cades Cove. Literally what happened was that they tore down all of the frame buildings and the old log cabins standing, and in many cases has over the years perpetuated this notion that Appalachian communities were rather isolated, different kinds of places, backward and not very well integrated into the other environments in the South in the 19th century. Durwood's book, which I would encourage you to get in the spring when it comes out, does a real effective job of pointing out that even Cades Cove, which in many ways was perhaps more removed than a lot of other mountain communities, was very well integrated into the surrounding regional economy and social and political system. It was not something separate and isolated and backward. In any event, Dunn describes the evolution of what he calls an ideological base. And he says, the ideological base for developing a permanent sense of community, the things that bound people in Cades Cove together, the ideological base for developing a permanent sense of community. A little later on he comments, so the land gradually blended with the people who settled it into one functional unity, and this unity represented in the best sense a community. Binding the people together was this pool of shared knowledge, an internal, invisible map with all its accompanying folklore, which they could recite as well as their family genealogy, and which they shared with no outsider. Dunn's description of early life in these mountain communities, in Cades Cove in particular, brings to mind many other descriptions of the relationship of mountain people to each other and to the land around them. One that I like is one by John Ely, which appears in his novel, The Landbreakers. The family and the clearing and the crops and the stock and the tools were part of the same thing, Ely writes. The family and the place were the same thing and could not be separated one from the other. One could not understand the family without knowing about the land and their work on it and plans for it. One could not know the land with any real understanding without knowing the people and the family. They were dusty with the land. The grit of the land was in them. Their work, which was done together, was the chief meaning of their family lives. Sociologists have recently noted that the meaning of land in Appalachia, in many cases, among especially more traditional communities, has a different meaning than what it meant in many other American communities. They draw a distinction between land as place, land as a set of relationships and experiences and memories and responsibilities to each other, versus land as commodity, something that could be bought and sold and simply move on. I think in many ways one of the most perceptive observers of this relationship between Appalachian people and each other within the context of this land was provided by Robert Coles in his book, Migrant Sharecroppers and Mountaineers. Coles wrote, "The mountaineer sees himself and his family and his kin and his friends as part of something well-nigh everlasting. Something that continues, goes on, stays, is there, however hard and difficult and miserably unfair life can be." I would go into the difference between perceiving land, between perceptions of time. Traditional peoples, and I think many in the Appalachian region, led fewer today than in the past, tend to see time as cyclical, as compared to a modern notion of time as linear. Of course, I guess I ought to draw the arrow that way. We think we're going that direction. Modern people, we never look back. We're always moving ahead, going somewhere. We don't know where. But our vision is this way. Traditional people tend to see you're born into a family, you live into a community, and you die, it's something like the cycles. What does Cole say? He sees himself and his family and his kin, his friends, as part of something well-nigh everlasting, something that continues and goes on and stays. Modern people, we tend not to know where we're going to be buried. We're allowed to be anywhere when we die, and they'll just plunk us down wherever we end up. Traditional people, I can still take you into coves in the mountains, and they know where they're going to be buried. They're going to be buried right up there on the ridge, along with all of their relatives and ancestors and people before them, and it's simply the completion of this life cycle. It's a different way of looking at life and understanding life. Now, time is only to place, in that people who have this kind of worldview on time also tend to have a specific notion of place, tend to be tied to a specific place. Whereas modern people, I should have drawn that way, modern people tend to be much abstract. We tend not to think of specific units in specific places. We tend to think in terms of the general and the abstract, and our connections are in that direction, rather than not in a specific place. I could spend a lot of time with this, but I think you get my point. There's a classic story in Cole's, and if we have time, I want to also read it because I think it speaks to this. Some of you know this account. It's the account that Coles describes of his morning observation of a mountain mother with her child. Indeed, from the first day of life, many of the Appalachian children I have observed are almost symbolically or ritualistic given over to the land. One morning I watched Mrs. Allen come out from the cabin in order, presumably, to enjoy the sun and the warm, clean air of a May day. Her boy had just been breastfed and was in her arms. Suddenly, the mother put the child down on the ground and gently fondled him and moved him a bit with her feet. Were not usually covered with shoes or socks. The child did not cry. This mother seemed to have exquisite control over her toes. It all seemed very nice, but I had no idea what Mrs. Allen really had in mind until she leaned over and spoke very gravely to her child. "This is your land, and it's about time you start getting to know it." I think there probably are other kinds of more common rituals that happen in the mountains that we don't generally tend to associate with that. Let me move on. Current scholarship, therefore, seems to be pointing us away from study of just the political economy of Appalachia in its narrow sense, as we did in the 1960s, and more in the direction of understanding the deep-seated cultural conflicts, the attitudes and the values and philosophy of life that have underlain these political conflicts. Today, more than ever, we are pressing to study the origins of what Roger Cunningham calls a mountain consciousness. We are pushing to study how that consciousness was altered by the forces of economic, political change. We need to understand more about values, ideology, morality, and ethics in the mountain past. We need to know more. We need more work on the intellectual history of the region, not solely from the perspectives of those who have come into Appalachia from the outside, as David has been doing in recent years, but from the perspective of those within mountain communities as well. We have defined Appalachia as a matter of race, economics, and social condition, but we've not bothered to define it by the patterns of its thought. How do different groups within the mountains define place over time in the region's history? How has the notion of place changed over time in the region? Research into the nature of the mountain community would undoubtedly reveal, I think, a bifurcated tradition. In Appalachia, like the rest of the country, individualism and commitment have both been part of our common heritage. As Robert Bellah and others have argued, Americans have always spoken a dual language. Individualism, community, not as opposites, but as a dual language. And I think that's an important, not as opposites, but as a dual language. One rooted in images of radical individualism, private achievement, personal consumption, and individual success. That is, our private world. The other in images of civic responsibility, social equality, public virtue, and commitment. Our public world. This second, or public language, was sent to what a number of scholars are now calling our early Republican with a small r tradition, one that dominated the early years of our history, while the voice of individualism emerged to dominate the cultural revolution that accompanied the rise of modern capitalism. Many contemporary observers of American society believe that this first language of individualism has so displaced our second language of civic virtue that it is undermining our capacity for commitment to one another and threatens the very fiber of our democratic life. I was engaged in a discussion the other day about mountain politics and how in the world we can bridge self-interest today to regain a sense of public or common good. Almost all Americans in the 1980s, writes Harry Boyd, have experienced some form of wrenching detachment from communal settings that might nourish a deep and continuous sense of what it means to be an American. Expressive individualism, these critics believe, not only saps us of the connectedness necessary for personal identity, but it weakens the social values of cooperation and responsibility necessary for a democratic society to function. Individualism separates us from the society around us and causes us to forget our ancestors, to forget our traditions, and to imagine that our whole destiny is in our own hands. We live for the present, lack concern for the well-being of others, and base our actions upon how we feel at the moment because we have little understanding of how others before us have acted. Like Jim Wayne Miller's Briar, we don't know any more about our history than a dog knows about his daddy. We try to live in somebody else's house. We're educated. We don't believe in nothing. Roots, however, don't exist in a singular vacuum. They require commitment to others, an interconnectedness that gives life to the whole. Unless we can study our ancestry, we can study our genealogy, but unless we transfer that to this necessary next step of connectedness to others, we never get beyond this individualism. Thus, the challenge before us today, argue a number of leading scholars, is not simply to abandon our first language in favor of the second, to abandon our private world in favor of the public sphere, but to reorient our individual lives for the benefit of the community as a whole, to regain a sense of balance between the two. Our pioneer ancestors placed a high value, for example, on self-sufficiency, on self-reliance. But that self-reliance had a clearly collective context, as scholarship such as that being done by Durward Dunn and others is indicating. It was as a people that they acted independently and self-reliantly. With the rise of modernism, the collective note is muted, and our primary obligation has come to be to ourselves. The differences which divide us in Appalachia today, therefore, may have less to do with whether one is a political action seeker or a creative research person. They may have much more to do with our involvement with the work itself and with the level of our commitment to personal and collective goals. Now, the last part of what I have to say this morning. How do we make this step from this theoretical, conceptual notion of ties and connectedness to our present situation? How do we nourish the collective spirit? For us in the mountains, to renew our communities, and keep in mind that I indicate the need for a renewal. I think many of these values have disappeared in the mountains too. I simply don't find them as present as I would like to see them. I think we still can identify them in some areas, but I'm not sure that they're really that strong today in the mountains. For us in the mountains to renew our communities and build a more just and equitable future for our children will require a new commitment and a fundamental alignment of our values. As we have learned in recent years, Appalachia will not be rescued from the outside, whether that be the federal government or the private sector. Renewal must begin from within, with the revitalization of communities and of the spirit of self-help and civic virtue. The recovery of community will require that we move beyond a defensive reaction against the things which threaten us and assume a positive initiative to create a new cultural context for democratic change. Such an initiative requires that we relearn old skills and that we acquire new perspectives, how to talk to each other, how to share with each other, how to recover collective memories, how to discern common values out of diverse traditions, how to connect personal troubles with social issues. This means that we must relearn the significance of our attachment to place and redefine that attachment within the context of contemporary life. Central to this process is the restoration of our collective memory. As is true with past social movements, the first step to collective consciousness is the recovery of those common experiences and customs which grant dignity to the individual and an alternative view of the prevailing culture. Let me give you an example. Martin Luther King recognized the importance of historical memory to the civil rights movement. And he encouraged his followers not only to recover the lost histories of blacks in America, but also to recover the lost meaning of democracy as well. For King, the civil rights movement was, quote, not only directed at the transformation of unjust structures, it was also a school for citizenship through which ordinary men and women acquire a new sense of somebodyness. People who have a sense of place have a sense of somebodyness. Having an understanding of how others before us have acted gives us the confidence to make decisions in the present, to create out of traditions from the past new visions of the future. Robert Bella considers historical memory to be essential to community. Communities have history, he writes. In an important sense, they are constituted by their past. And for this reason, we can speak of a real community as a community of memory, one that does not forget its past. In order not to forget that past, a community is involved in retelling its story, its constitutive narrative, and in so doing, it offers examples of men and women who embodied and exemplified the meaning of that community. Modern culture, with its emphasis on change, has a way of robbing us of historical memory. Appalachians have been especially victimized by that tendency, and until we do a better job of recovering and retelling our history, we will be unable to recognize and evaluate the alternative social visions that have existed within our own past. Only then can we hope to develop an alternative conception of the meaning of a good life, and thus an alternative vision for the future. Recovering our collective memory will also help us learn once again to talk to each other, to share with each other, and to discern our common values, to reestablish those relationships which define place. As the oral history students of the 1970s learned, recording the oral traditions of their neighbors required more than mechanical skills. It taught them how to communicate and how to listen, how to think across time, how to relate the lives of individuals to the larger social order. Above all, it gave them insight into the values that constituted their communities and into the lives of the men and women who sustained them. In the process, they became tied to that community of memory themselves. Renewing our individual ties to our communities of memory, to our place, is a further step toward building active democratic citizenship. Classical republicanism evoked an image of the active citizen contributing to the public good. And this, notes Bella and others, requires us to see the individual within the context of the larger community. And I spent yesterday morning in North Carolina talking specifically about this issue of the revival of democratic citizenship. How do we, the individual within the context of our larger community, rather than seeing the self as the only or main form of reality. Remembering our heritage involves accepting our origins, including the painful memories of prejudice and poverty and exploitation that the pressures to modernize have attempted to deny. Accepting these painful memories is often the wellspring for social consciousness. Thus, leaving behind one kind of individualism will help us acquire a new civic individualism that entails care for the affairs of the community and a new definition of the relationship of individuals to society. Let us take, for example, the meaning of work in our modern world. How does the way that we define work affect our relationship to community? How does the way in which we in Appalachian Studies define our roles as scholars, teachers, and activists affect our ability to relate to mountain communities and mountain people? When I was growing up, I was encouraged to, quote, make something of myself by moving beyond my raising, beyond my family and the cultural place of which I was a part. I wonder to what extent those of us in the academic industry today feel this sense of our work as commitment to that larger community which we profess to study, or to what extent we simply use the community to further our own careers and institutional goals, or to test our most recent intellectual theory. Is our work in our own discipline defined in terms of self-fulfillment or in terms of its contribution to the common good? Rebuilding the community will, moreover, require more from us in the future than have provided in the past. It will mean, above all, that we take seriously the challenge to provide a vision of what things might become in the mountains and in the larger society. Martin Luther King again recognized the importance of vision and dreams to his people, and he constantly reminded them of that dream. King knew the meaning of that verse in Proverbs, "There is no vision, the people perish." We might add that where there are no visionaries, the dreams perish as well. Building a vision of an alternative future based upon strong community ties will require a new kind of thinking, a new kind of mind for Americans whose culture has been so strongly shaped by modern individualism. Yet, as I have argued, we may have with our own mountain traditions the roots from which this new spiritual value may arise. Ethics of respect, hard work, family, self-reliance, personal dignity, tolerance, faithfulness, cooperation, and democracy. Our task is to fashion these strands of individualism and community into a practical ideology that is appropriate for a new era. Eudora Welty, who in many ways for me bridged Appalachia and the rest of the South. Her mother was from West Virginia. She was deeply tied to West Virginia. She was raised in Mississippi. Eudora Welty once observed, and I quote, "It is by knowing where you stand that you grow able to judge where you are. One place comprehended can make us understand other places better. Sense of place gives equilibrium. Extended, it is sense of direction." Perhaps the search for community in Appalachia may provide a sense of direction for the rebuilding of community in America as a whole. The mountains are changing, and we can never regain what is lost. The strong attachments to place which characterize the identity of our ancestors is weakening under the onslaught of mass society. But to change does not necessarily imply that we are powerless to control our own destiny. As George Tyndall has observed about the Southern experience as a whole, we learn time and again from the Southern past and from the history of others that to change is not necessarily to disappear. Not necessarily to disappear. And we learn from the modern psychology that to change is not necessarily to lose one's identity. To change sometimes is to find it. And I'll stop there.
I have listened this morning with a great deal of interest to the papers in this symposium. I've been very much impressed indeed by them. My old student, Earl Foster, did himself real proud. I'm going back and see what grade I gave him. The other day I got a letter from a student, one of my first students at the University of Kentucky, fussing at me after nearly 60 years because I gave him a D. And he told me where he'd been. He'd gone on for advanced work apparently in history, including going to Harvard. And he twisted my ears again for being such an observant and careless professor as to give him a D. I haven't answered that letter yet, but I'm going to write and tell him that maybe I stirred him up. Maybe that's the reason he went on and got another degree. A thought just occurred to me, George, after one or two things you said there. The first time I ever laid eyes on this sacred bosom of the Holy Land of Kentucky was in front of the Morehead railway station. I got on the train on September the 13th, 1928. And there was a great commotion on the train. People running up and down, and I knew there was some excitement. I thought maybe Ring Brothers Circus was hooked on behind the train. A woman from Louisville was sitting in the seat ahead of me and said, "You know who's on this train?" Well, it was Charlie Curtis, who was for the Vice Presidency of the United States. I had about as much knowledge of the geography of Kentucky as I had of the geography of Tibet. And I had to port me up in Ashland to get dressed for Lexington. And we bumped along. When I got in Pullman, there was only one seat made up. And there was this bald-headed man sitting in it, and I recognized him right off as Chief Charlie Curtis. I sat down by him, rode from Ashland to Lexington with him. And when we got out here to the Morehead station, he patted me on the knee and said, "I've got to go back and make a speech." since he's dead and gone, I'll tell you what he said. He said, "This is a bad place." I was amused at the fact that he was the first Republican I ever saw in my life who wasn't a postmaster. I wish I could treat this subject in the very sophisticated fashion of Rural Foster or Ron Ellis, but I'm talking about a very down-to-earth subject, the country store. I spent a solid year, 1940, 1941, ransacking country stores all the way from Virginia to the Texas border. I came away smelling like cheese, fat back, human bodies, the store cat, and everything else associated with accidents in the country store. I picked up an enormous cargo of records, accumulation of records, which now are preserved. They could not now be had. They are not now available in the form that I found them. I had the very great pleasure in many stores of picking up records that hadn't been untied in years. Going through, looking at those records, trying to reconstruct some picture of the economic and social life of the rural South. I picked up 3 or 4 very interesting bits of folklore in that round. I came so close to biting on 3 of these things. I was told that, and I did come on illiterate storekeepers. I came on one storekeeper who could not write in his account books. Ladies, a wife had to take care of him. But he had a box of corn, one full box, one empty box. And when he made a sale, he would transfer grains of corn into the empty box so his wife could tell how much business he'd done that day. Around, he had entered something in the case, this merchant had entered something on his books that was round. And when they came to settle up in the fall, he charged a customer with a hoop of cheese. And the customer said, "I never bought any hoop of cheese. Something wrong with that." And he said, "Well, something round, what was it?" He said, "I bought a grindstone." And the merchant said, "Oh, I forgot to put the hole in it." Another wonderful one that I picked up down on the edge of the Pinocchio Swamp was a saddle story. That this clerk, busy Saturday morning, people standing around the stove and rushing in and out of the store, had sold a customer a saddle. But he forgot to ask the customer what his name was. He didn't know him. So he went to the merchant and said, "I've sold a saddle, but I don't know who I sold it to." And the merchant said, "Well, we'll settle that." He said, "I'll pick out 20 of my best customers, 20 people that I think are able to buy a saddle, and we'll charge each one of them with a saddle. And when it comes settling time, 19 of them will protest." In a wonderful store out from Lafayette, Louisiana, I actually saw the wall. I hope this story was true. At least it was painted over. This merchant didn't keep paper right. He recorded his record on the wall. When he charged something to a customer, he'd walk over and record it on the wall. He went into Lafayette to get supply from the wholesale house, and while he was gone, his wife and daughters thought the store looked so disreputable, they went in and painted it. And when he came home, he took a look at it, and he said, "My God, you painted us out of business." The store gone. The store that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about these little things that you dash into and buy Coca-Cola, a quick soft drink. Some pick up a little handful of groceries. I'm talking about an institution that existed in Kentucky and in the lower South, a very vital institution. As good as the book is, as much of a seminal book as it has been, C. Van Woodward, in his Origin of the New South, wrote only half a book. The story of the South since the Civil War, the story of the economic problems of the South, the social problems, the social advances, almost every aspect of the rural South is recorded in those country store books. There was an institution that was more than a mercantile house. It was a gathering place. Three very important rural social institutions have disappeared from Kentucky and from the South. Number one, the country store. I would give anything if I could turn back the pages of history and go once again as a boy with a bucket of eggs. I didn't have a basket, went with a bucket of eggs, trade eggs for bits of merchandise. I have in my little wood shop a collection of brown bottles. I've got about 24 of them that I'm trying to figure out how to mount them to illustrate or document the point that I'm now making, of Garrett snuff. It pains me now to go into a store and see that Garrett snuff has become modernized. It's in paper packages, which is a desecration of an institution within it. Right? The store was a source of advice. Many a time, a customer went to a storekeeper to advise him as to what he should do in the planting of a crop, in the sale of the crop, in signing a mortgage, in making other decisions. Even he went to the store to ask about decisions of intimate family affairs. The merchant was a source of refuge. I still use some of the old country stores. I own some rural land in which it's necessary for me to know who's who and what's going on. And I spot a storekeeper and ask him, because he certainly knows who can be trusted and who can't be trusted. And he'll tell you why it can't be trusted from very long experience dealing with that institution. The country store was a source of information. It was a link with the outside world in those many tentacles of the outside world that penetrated the region. It also was a source of information for the outside world itself. The country merchant oftentimes acted as agents for various commercial enterprises, the wholesale houses, the great wholesale houses, for the fertilizer manufacturers, for other forms, the packing houses, for instance, for other forms of the commercial and merchandising world. In the store records, which are stored at the University of Kentucky Library, and we had a president of the University of Kentucky who should have been taken out and hanged upside down and let the Qatar patrons throw darts at him. We had money from the Rockefeller Foundation to put that mass of stuff, tremendous mass of stuff, in order. And this president, who had about as much historical sense as a mole, came along and disorganized it. And we're just now getting it reorganized again. But in that mound of stuff is a record that in many ways is more accurate, more precise in reflecting the patterns of rural life than the United States Census itself or other statistical or documentary sources. The historian can find materials for reconstructing a profile of rural America, whether it be rural economic America, maybe I should say rural South or rural Kentucky, whether it be economic, social, or financial. That record is there, written sometimes in very pitiful, heart-rending notes of crop failures, of disasters, of family tragedies and what have you. The country store was a place of first refuge. I don't know how many of you in this room have ever seen those little packages, little gray packages that were held 4 or 5 items, a set of handles, a set of hinges, a nameplate, and 1 or 2 and tacks for lining coffins. When an individual died in a community, somebody ran up to the store to say that this individual had died. It was necessary to make a coffin for him and buy that package of coffin hardware which the merchant had readily for him. The same thing was true of births. Somebody ran up to the store and said that a baby was born. The merchant got there almost as quick as a cup of hot water with his assistance in that birth. He handled the flannel. I want to go back. He handled the goods that made the shroud for those who passed on. He handled his flannel that swathed the baby, the cloth that made the diapers, and other supplies for bringing one into the world. He literally went with them all the way from the cradle to the grave, and even beyond the grave. Most often he was called upon, thinking that he was a literate person in the community, he was called upon to write an obituary. And many a country store keeper sent, that is, if this fellow had paid his bills, sent him on to St. Peter with a glowing recommendation as a prospective customer in that great world beyond the cotton patch and beyond the greasy fat meat counter in the country store. I shall never forgive my father for his denying me one of life's simple pleasures. The merchant was correspondent for his customers, his illiterate customers who could not write, and some of the literate ones who were not certain what to write. They went to the country storekeeper asking him to write letters for them. Sometimes they asked him to order merchandise that competed with his own stock. Sometimes they had to get he had to get his customers out of trouble because they ordered COD packages that had to be paid for and didn't have money enough to pay for them, so he had to sell out and buy them or send them back, whichever one he wanted to do. But back to my father. My father was a social secretary of sorts. He wrote letters for people who couldn't write letters for themselves. And a great many of those letters had to be of an amorous sort. I always wanted to write some of those letters because I had in mind make certain commitments in those letters that could not always be fulfilled either by the party of the first part or by the party of the second part. And my father never would permit me to involve the community in a scandal. And I've never quite forgiven him for that. But sometimes there were some wonderful letters that came out. I have an example here of letters which began, one letter. All these country store letters always began pretty much by a formula. I take my pen in hand. Well, he could barely make a cross mark. He couldn't take a pen in hand. I take my pen in hand to tell you that we are well and hope you're well. And then he proceeds to say, we're all well except Ma. She's down in the back, and she's ailing. And then he goes on and winds up with saying, Mary that you quoted so long, Mary is quoting again, which is cheerful news to the receiver. And then he says, Lily has another baby. You're a true friend. Those elements had to get in there. Let them know what was going on. There was that gentleman down in Tennessee who went to the Williams store in Eagleville, Tennessee, and asked the merchant, Mr. Williams, to write a letter to his girlfriend and express to that girlfriend some very warm sentiments. Dear friends, Dear friend, will you allow me to correspond with you? Not at all will I blush to say that I am in love with you so much. You can see the phonetic spelling of the merchant that I'm reading here. It will break my heart for you to go back on me. I hope you will grant me the privilege of escorting you to the Centennial at Nashville, May the 1st, 1897. I am glad you say that your compliments are accepted with many thanks. Return for your past favorites to express myself before going too far. If you were only mine, I'd be the happiest man in the world. Oh, you are so fine. It makes me cry to hear you when you tell me you will only be mine. Then there was a stinger to that. He added postscript. How long do you wish me to wait? This is 8 years I've waited for you. If you have never sat in a country store on a wet day when it was about 25 degrees on the outside and about 105 degrees on the inside, and run foxes all over the hills, treed some of the biggest coons that we ever caught, grew some of the finest crops. There have been some marvelous crops of tobacco that never really got to market, but they were grown nevertheless around the hot stove. But those wonderful conversations of how long those rattlesnakes were that they killed up there on the hill last summer. I have never known a country store rattlesnake to be less than 10 feet and have less than 25 rattles on the end of his tail. Nor have I ever known a coon to be less than 25 pounds in weight. Copperheads have also grown long. But of course, no matter what they caught out of the creek, it was going to be a whopper by the time it got to the country store. Fish always bit around the stove. You could always bet that in one place you were going to catch fish. Which was, you never could take one of them home with you once you'd caught him. I have heard and I've read records sitting around the store. The old-timers, if they had been with Dewey, they could have whipped the Spaniards in a minute. During World War I heard conversations in country stores that if only they would let him get the Kaiser Bill, they could bring him home tomorrow. They could have beat Luke Lee to him and brought him right back to, and once they got him here, they'd take care of him all right. But the strange thing about it, they were in the service, out in search of our Kaiser Bill. No matter what the United States Senate, if the country store league, the old league that I'm talking about, had been dealing with Judge Bork, they would have had him canned within 30 minutes. But some way or other, this country has always overlooked its leadership. No wonder it has gotten in such an infernal mess, because it has never elected those boys who could run the country so much better than Grover Cleveland ran it, or Woodrow Wilson, and certainly better than Ronald Reagan at the present time. I wish, once again, I could go back. I'm sorry that I can't tell you some of these stories. I wish again I could go back and sit on a country house, boarding house porch, and hear those marvelous stories that those gentlemen of the road, the old-time drummers, had to say. There was more truth than fiction to the drummer and the farmer's daughter in the passage through the country. My first introduction to the drummer, before I got to the examining the store records, were the packages of sample goods they throw out at your mailbox. You ride down the road, throw out about a half an ounce of Arm & Hammer soda, sample some other goods. But the drummer served three functions to a community. He served as a man who brought merchandise to the store, purely commercial function. He performed a news function. Driving along the road with his trucks loaded, he observed the condition of crops. He stopped along the road and talked to people. When he got to the country store, he brought a great budget of news from the outside world with him. And the third thing he did, and you don't know what magic is until you see a country drummer open up his trunk and display the merchandise, the latest merchandise that he brought from the city. I would like to be present once again when a drummer opened up his trunk and brought out an Admiral Dewey corset, for instance, that pinched the middle to the sides of an hourglass and enlarged the upper and certainly amplified the lowers. I'd like to be present when they brought out that display of garters with "Love Me Not." I never could see in those heavy dresses and tall button shoes on the Sam Hill anybody ever saw a garter that forbade you to tread on forbidden ground. I could never quite understand how that, why that piece of merchandise sold. But imagine going through all the line of changing styles. That's one of the things that he brought to the backcountry, was information, not only information, but he brought examples of the styles that were in style 5 years ago on Fifth Avenue, but just now reaching the Robertson's Crossroads. And they didn't know the difference at Robertson's Crossroads anyway, so they were right in style with the times as they saw it. Go to a church meeting and you'd see those bird nest hats. You'd see those high button shoes, those flowing skirts, and every one of them was dressed up in something that had a foreign name on it, such names as French Lyle, for instance. Never any American thing. That wouldn't sell. Or Belgian lace, or English cloth. Always it brought the international commercial world right down to the crossroads. They might have been made in Greensboro, North Carolina, but nevertheless they had that foreign taste. And Southern womanhood went forth decked out in what was the latest style in Paris. Popped eyes before the counter and see that wonderful display of knives. I wish I could go up and make the decision that many a country boy had to, whether to buy a one-bladed Barlow for 15 cents or buy a two-blade genuine Barlow with an arrow through the R for 25 cents. I would like to also go up before a protracted meeting and buy from the specialty counter that the country store merchant kept a dime's bottle of horse perfume, 10 cents a bottle, and you could smell a whole protracted meeting right out of existence with that purchase. There were other communicators. They were master communicators. I eat my dinner most evenings with somebody advertising something, preparation H, preparation H, I almost got it right, or some other rather intimate material, and I can't tell whether I have the itch or the AIDS listening to the evening news. If a visitor from Morris had stepped into a country store in Kentucky or the South in 1908, he would have been certain that everybody was dying with chills, malaria and chills, with indigestion, backache, constipation, fallen wounds, loss of manhood, indigestion, degenerating livers, and blurred vision. And there was always somebody on hand to help him out of those dilemmas. There was almost no end of bourbon-laced tonics that appeal to even the most rabid teetotaler. Take one good swig of Peruna and the world seemed to be all right all around. There were the famous cures, Peruna, pronounced Peruna, Husky, Tanlac, and heaven knows how many other tonics that were bourbon. I remember an old uncle of mine telling my father that he was taking Tanlac. He was taking 2 big tablespoons full of Tanlac before dinner. He never felt better in his life. He'd been just as well off if he'd taken 2 tablespoons of pure bourbon. It would have let him up just as bright as he was on that time. Then there were the carbolic salves that cured every kind of wound, every kind of pain that a person could have. There were the little pills, no end of the little pills. There were, I can't refrain from mentioning 2 of them. One I think is still available, Carter's Little Liver Pill. That set you right no matter what you had. And then there was one that was euphoniously named DeWitt's Little Early Riser. My favorite, rural, you literary fellows, you don't really know what the South read, what the rural South and rural Kentucky, and I still read it if I can find one. I like the DeVoe's, Professor DeVoe's Lady's Birthday Almanac, published by the Chattanooga Medicine Company. No self-respecting home could be without a wine of Cardoy and black draft calendar hanging over the mantelpiece and a Lady's Birthday Almanac hooked on a nail alongside the birthday almanac. Once you had a home fixed up with those 2 things, you had a home that was able to face any literary problem or any health problem that might come along. Dr. Andrew DeVoe was an amateur meteorologist, lived up in Hackensack, New Jersey. Each year, he would prophesy what was going to happen that year. He'd tell you precisely if it's going to rain or going to snow or it's going to be cloudy or be clear. He'd tell you when the sun came up and when the sun went down. He'd tell you which zodiac sign your organs were functioning under. Then he would throw in a lot of information. He'd tell you how many inches there were in a foot, how many feet there were in a mile, how far it was from Paris to London, or from wherever you were to Tibet. A veritable source of information. It always seemed that the countryman had something wrong with his liver. With a pure stomach, a clear skin, and an unclouded brain, a man has no desire to be drunken. Dr. Simmons' regulator produces this effect by arousing the digestive organs to healthy action. And to the ladies, God bless them, Dr. Simmons had this poetic advice: if your wife is weak and ailing and has trouble with her liver, and you want to make her happy, what's the best thing you can give her? You might give her a new bonnet, but our profit will be much greater if you give her a bottle or 2 of Dr. Simmons' liver regulator. Dr. Simmons fortified that advice by telling his patients that he manufactured powerful stuff. George Roy Bean of Pecos fame was an addict of Simmons' regulator. So was Andy Adams, the cowboy, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the Clanton gang of Wild West fame. All of these people rode out on the cattle range out to enforce the law, reinforced with Dr. Simmons' liver regulator, and they were healthy specimens of his nostril. The liquor store, as I've said, was a source of many bits and pieces of Southern and Kentucky society. It pains me to know that 3 institutions have died. One, the 4th-class post office, has gone by the board. There's nothing upsets rural society more than the infernal planners in the postal service in Washington. They are soulless creatures who uproot communities and displace all sorts of institutions. The second one is displacement of country school, which was a center of a community communication and interest. And finally, no longer are those big square fronts that bore the term general merchandise. The politicians, and some of the politicians we have now, don't think deserve a public forum. But once the country store was a veritable forum of politics with the candidates present or not present. The candidates came along, and here in Kentucky, they plastered their signs up on the storefront, and they didn't anymore get wet by the first rain. We had so frequent elections that a new crop was pasted. Reminded me of a mountain man up here at West Liberty in Morgan County. I was teaching an extension course, and they drive up a bunch of white stakes right over the mountain. And I kept seeing those stakes. I asked the man, I said, what do those stakes mean? And he said, we're not sure until after the election. Well, there was just a veritable succession of political handbills and whatnot that flowed through the country store. The countertops were literally plastered with cards of candidates seeking office. There is no more definitive statement. No more definitive statement has ever been made in rural America than I heard it up at the store. Thank you.
Those things that belong to a writer and perhaps to nobody else may be tied up with the writer's place, with a locale and a way of life and a collective experience in which the creative process and the writer's resources meet. It's not always been easy for the American writer to recognize the materials that belong to him or her. Archibald Higbie is the failed artist in Edgar Limask's Spoon River anthology, who so identifies with a highbrow tradition that he's alienated from the life of his place, Spoon River, the life he knows, and which, as a consequence of his attitude, though, is available to him as an artist only inadvertently. He's a pathetic figure, and he confesses that he was ashamed of Spoon River, Illinois. Trying to rise above this ordinary background, Higbie goes to Rome and to Paris and lives with artists and tries, as he says, to breathe the air that the masters breathed and to see the world with their eyes. But when he exhibits his works, people look at them and say, "What are you driving at, my friend?" Sometimes the face looks like Apollo's, at others it has a trace of Lincoln's. Well, see, Higbie failed because he couldn't acknowledge the things that belonged to him. And like Higbie, a lot of American writers have not always been able to get into the right relationship with those things that truly belong to them. And for the reason that Emerson points out in The American Scholar. He says that as a young nation we had culture, and our notion of culture from one place, Europe, but our duties, the settlement of the land and the building of the country, from another. Robert Frost had this very circumstance in mind when he wrote his poem, The Gift Outright, in which he says, the land was ours before we were the land's. Like Archibald Higbie, we were withholding ourselves from our place, and this withholding of ourselves made us weak, Frost says. Well, these insights of Emerson and Master and Frost make it clear that because of our history, place is especially important for an American writer. And I say this without wishing to impute any mystique to place. My work, for example, is associated with this place generally, southern Appalachia, the upland South, the heights of Dixie as opposed to the heart of Dixie, as it's been called. And it's been that way ever since my poems received any kind of critical attention. And that's almost 25 years ago now. In the spring of 1963, I sent a little sequence of poems to Maxine Cumming, who at that time was conducting Poetry Workshop, a bi-monthly column in the magazine The Writer. And she has subsequently, of course, gone on to receive a Pulitzer Prize for her poems and no longer conducts that workshop. And in the July 1963 number of that magazine, Cumin commented at length on those poems that I sent, not bothering to notify me, though, that she was going to. I just picked them up off of a magazine rack. I think it was in Nashville. I remember it was hot, and I bought the magazine and walked down the street and read this comment that she made on my poems. She reprinted one of them that was later to appear in the collection Copperhead Cane and then taken up in Dialogue with Dead Man. This is the poem that she reprinted, and then she discussed it in terms of a sense of place. It's called Hanlon Mountain in Mist. Ryle Sams came by, but now house is still and cold with dread. Unless this weather breaks, I look for another grave on Newfound Hill. Rain rumbles on the roof, splashes from the eaves and foams and bubbles into tubs below the spouts. The barn, the shingles on the crib drip black with rain. Springhouse mosses go frog green, and Hanlon's tops lost in mist. Ryle Sams climbed Hanlon with his hounds last night, but when they winded something below the top and wouldn't go beyond the lantern light and trembled on the lead, he came home. I trust the hounds. They know what made them stop, what waits there in the mist on Hanlon's top. Well, I was simply writing in the aftermath of a death in the family, and using the old superstition that sometimes deaths come in 2 or 3, and there's that dread that something else might happen. The detail of this poem Cumin wrote, even without the cumulative bolstering of the other poems, quite easily conveys the setting. This is hill country, hunting country. The proper name, Ryle Sams, and the place names, Newfound Hill and Hanlon, evoke to me, she says, a backwoods section, the Ozarks possibly. Not a bad guess. The scenes depicted might well have been from the Ozarks, or from any place in rural Kentucky, or from any number of other places. The place names happen to be from my home area in western North Carolina. But I think that nobody would ever suspect that many of the details for this poem came to me from New England. Not long before I wrote this poem, I had been reading Nathaniel Hawthorne's Mosses from an Old Man's. To make my poem, I quite consciously borrowed details from this passage from Hawthorne. All day long and for a week together, the rain was drip, drip, dripping and splash, splash, splashing from the eaves and bubbling and foaming into the tubs beneath the spouts. The old unpainted shingles of the houses and the outbuildings were black with moisture, and the mosses of ancient growth upon walls looked fresh and green, as if they were the newest things and afterthoughts of time. The usually mirrored surface of the river was blurred by an infinity of raindrops. The whole landscape had a completely water-soaked appearance, conveying the impression that the earth was wet through like a sponge, while the summit of the wooded hill, about a mile distant, was enveloped in a dense mist, where the demon of the tempest seemed to have his abiding place and to be plotting still direr inclemencies. That's Hawthorne's passage. Now, I couldn't use Latinate language like still direr inclemencies, but I did borrow some of the other details from that. And I certainly don't want to get in a Biden-like position here, but you'll have to decide for yourself whether I made a poem and borrowed some details or whether I plagiarized. But I hope this example makes clear why I don't wish to impute a mystique to any particular place. Those details from New England description, many of them fitted right into my southern Appalachian description. And I hope nobody finds any witless yodeling about mountains in my poems. I am aware of a tradition, much in evidence since the 18th century, which romanticizes mountains and mountain people. Roland Barthes, the French scholar and critic, speaks of a bourgeois alpine myth a mystique about mountains, which he says causes people to take leave of their senses any time the ground is uneven. It is this romanticizing of mountains and mountain people that we find in Blake's lines from the 18th century. Great things are done when men and mountains meet. This is not done by jostling in the street. Or in Byron's lines, to me high mountains are a feeling, but the hum of cities torture. Or in Schiller, on the mountains there is freedom. The mystique of mountains and mountain people is found in the writings of John Muir, who has been mentioned here this morning. In John of the Mountains in 1938, he says, the mountains are fountains of men as well as of rivers, of glaciers and fertile soil. The great poets, philosophers, prophets, able men whose thoughts and deeds moved the world have come down from the mountains, mountain dwellers who have grown strong there with the forest trees in nature's workshops. Well, that's a lot of waffle. According to Barthes, a kind of moral geography springs from man's ability to adapt himself to hostile environments. Mountains seem to encourage a morality of effort and solitude. This moral geography was carried so far in the 19th century that James Russell Lowell finally pointed out its absurdity when he called for a new system of literary criticism in which he said a want of sublimity would be inexcusable in a native of the mountains. Place is only one factor among many that shape people's lives, but no other factor may be more important. Somerset Maugham in The Razor's Edge says that men and women are not only themselves, they are also the region in which they are born. The city apartment or the farm on which they have learned to walk, the games they play with children, the old wives' tales they overheard. It is all these things that make them what they are, and these are the things that you can't come to know by hearsay. You can only know them if you have lived them. Place does make a difference in people's lives, certainly. And Wallace Stevens, the American poet, knows that and suggested when he points out, one is not Duchess 100 yards from a carriage. He also elaborates on that in another poem called Anecdote of Men by the Thousand, and he says, there are men of a valley who are that valley. There are men whose words are as natural sounds of their places. The dress of a woman of Lhasa in its place is an invisible element of that place made visible. I am interested in that invisible element of a place, and as a poet, in ways of making that invisible element visible. Now it happens that this place, the Appalachian region of America, being neither north nor south exactly, and neither east nor west, but a kind of geographical and historical and cultural, and I would maintain a spiritual borderland, has an interesting and a complicated past, and an equally interesting and complicated present. The historian Carl Degler says that the Appalachian region has a triple history. A history that the region shares with the rest of the United States, a history that it shares partly with the lowland South, and then a history that is all its own. As a poet, I'm interested in this triple history, in the individual and collective experience of the people, and in the contemporary conditions and future possibilities or lack of them that flow from that past and present. It is in this approach to place that I discover those things with my sources and resources, things which belong to me as a poet. And one source which is inseparable from place is folk speech. T.S. Eliot said that no poetry is ever exactly the same speech that the poet talks or hears. But the music of poetry must be a music latent common speech of its time. And that means also that it must be latent in the common speech of the poet's place. There's general agreement on this sort of thing. William Carlos Williams says, by listening to the language of his locality, the poet begins to learn his craft. James Still about whom you've heard this morning demonstrate the truth of Frost's observation everywhere in his poems and in his novels and stories, still is so familiar with the folk speech of his place that you sometimes can't be sure whether he's employing a turn of speech that he's overheard and jotted down in his notebooks, or whether he's just simulating the spirit of that folk speech. He can make it up. It sounds just like it, I think, sometimes. I think of the ending of his little story, Journey to the Forks, about two little boys, brothers, who are having second thoughts about leaving home to attend a settlement school. One of the boys says, "There never was a pure scholar amongst all our folks. Never a one went all the way through the books and come out yon side." Their journey is implicit in that spatial metaphor of going through the books and coming out yon side. And the boy's brother, who is the narrator, unobtrusively, the same little boy, by the way, who is the narrator of River of Earth, he unobtrusively elaborates on that metaphor of the journey in the story's concluding sentence, which is, "We started down the ridge, picking our way through the stony dark," which is an ending that is also a metaphor for the education that those are about to undertake. You'll find the journey metaphor is an overarching one in all Still's work, in the poems, in the stories, and in the novels. After all, the River of Earth is a kind of journey you heard about this morning. Kurt Vonnegut thinks that any writer is fortunate to have grown up in Ireland or in Appalachia, he says. And and fortunate to have these varieties of English as a resource. Vonnegut says, "I myself grew up in Indianapolis, where common speech sounds like a bandsaw cutting galvanized tin, and where it employs a vocabulary as unornamental as a monkey wrench. But that speech is peculiarly his, and he doesn't deny it. He's not an Archibald Higbee." Vonnegut says, I myself find that I trust my own writing most, and other people seem to trust it most too, when I sound like a person from Indianapolis, which is what I am. What alternatives do I have? Another resource inseparable from place, and is something that's already been commented on this morning by Reuel Foster, is theme. Is this maybe the invisible element that Wallace Stevens is talking about, that a writer can make visible? A theme present in the collective experiences of people in any place. Donald Davidson, a member of that fugitive agrarian group at Vanderbilt that also been mentioned this morning, and my teacher there in the early 60s, once mentioned in a letter to Allen Tate that he was thinking about writing an epic about Tennessee in which he would employ the Faust theme. Tate replied that a Tennessean Faust was impossible because the Faust theme is not in the experience of Tennesseans. "I think there is one fundamental law of poetry," Tate wrote back to Davidson, "and it is negative. You can't create a theme. Themes are or are not available. You can't put your epic of Tennessee into the minds of Tennesseans, your Faust epic. The precondition of your writing is that it must, in an equivalent of spiritual intensity, already be there." Here, Tate suggests how we can distinguish between the genuine literature of a place and then writing that's simply about a place. And we can consider whether the themes of the writing are expressive of something in the place and in its history and in its experience, or whether they are expressive of some fashion and merely pasted on a particular place like a decal on a windshield. I like to think that the figure of the briar who emerges in my collection, The Mountains Have Come Closer, and who's going to make another appearance next year in a publication called The Briar, His Book, will be available from Noman Press. I like to think that the briar is the embodiment of a theme that is in the place and the people that I'm writing about. I like to think that he is an invisible element of this place made visible. Because people ask me, they say, "There's no metaphor in this poem. You're always talking about the importance of metaphor. How come?" Well, the briar is a metaphor. The briar is the embodiment of of a figure. He's the representative person. At least that was my intention. But I think he was already there. I didn't so much make up the briar as I just discovered him. He was there already. He was in the experience. And in thinking about place and people's relationship to place, I hope I've discovered something about the Appalachian region and about America and about all countries. But here is the briar finding out something about himself, the briar losing touch with his traditions. Once he was a chair maker. People up north discovered him. They said he was, quote, an authentic mountain craftsman, unquote. People made pictures of him working. He got famous. He got a lot of orders for his chairs. And when he moved up to Cincinnati so he could be closer to his market, besides a lot of his people lived there now, he found out he was a briar. And when his customers found out he was using an electric lathe and a power drill just to keep up with all the orders, they said he was losing touch with his traditions. And his orders fell off, something awful. Well, he figured it had been a bad mistake to let those magazine people take pictures of him with his power tools, clean shaven, and wearing a flowered sport shirt and drip-dry pants. So he moved back down to East Kentucky and had himself a brochure printed up with a picture of him using his hand lathe, bearded and barefoot in faded overalls. And then when folks would come from the magazines, he'd get rid of them before supper time so he could put on his shoes and his flowered sport shirt and his double knit pants and open a can of beer and watch the 6:30 news on TV out of New York and Washington. He had to have some time to be himself. Now, if you will look in the current issue of the New York Times Book Review, you will find an interview here with Czesław Miłosz, who is the Nobel Prize winner for poetry in 1980. He's a Polish-Lithuanian. He's part of that group of people who came out in post-World War II. And he's being interviewed on the notion of poetry and the relationship to them and how these themes do grow out of certain places. And, of course, the conventional wisdom is that Appalachia is this isolated place cut off from the rest of the country and it has to be picked up by the scruff of the neck and dragged into the 20th century. Actually, Appalachia is probably as much a creation of the 19th and 20th century as it is anything that lagged behind it. We still haven't figured out, but people like Roger Cunningham's trying mightily to help us understand that. Well, anyway, he comes from a place in Eastern Europe where the same sorts of things apply. And Archie Green has already pointed out to us how much Poland is the Appalachia of the Russian Empire. We're talking about looking at a region in order to understand something about global and international situations. And he says, I reduced this thing down to 74% of the original size. He says, it's true, though, that historical circumstances have often wrung literary works out of me in which either I or some persona, usually a persona, spoke as the medium for certain collective feelings. In other words, here's the man writing about Poland and Lithuania doing the same thing that I've done here, you see. Take persona like the briar and talks about things that not concern him personally so much as concern somebody, a collective experience. And then further over there in this interview he says, even to me a great many things still seem unclear. Bravo. In any case, the desire to communicate a true image of myself is a constant. And as I look at the writing of this region, I think that is one of the motives, that's one of the reasons why people write, and that's one of the things they write about. A wish to communicate a true image of themselves and their lives. And the irony in my little story about the briar here is that he's finally discovered that people have this certain image of him, and he's willing to manipulate that for his own purposes, but still he wants to have a little time to be himself. And I am trying to, through that figure, communicate a true image of people. So that's why I think I I hook in some way to a genuine theme that's there in the experience of the people. In the contemporary world, I want to suggest to you that the word place, the concept place, and along with place, regions and regional life and local life, these things have a different significance and a value from what they've had in the past. Part of that significance may be negative. We might as well face that. It may be negative in its implications. That is, we may find regions and local life more attractive because we've lost faith in our ability to make a difference in our larger institutions and at the national level. Whereas we still have faith that we can have some effect at the local and at the regional level. We may value local life because we have so little of it. Think about that. Just as we value traditions because they're forever dissolving. And so we invent them. We make them up. This is what Rybczynski writes in the book Home, A Short History of an Idea. He says, acute awareness of tradition is a modern phenomenon that reflects a desire for custom and routine in a world characterized by constant change and innovation. This may be reasons why we're holding a conference on place, the larger context. The most unflattering interpretation of renewed interest in regions and localism sees regional perspectives painted with the old evils we're all familiar with. That is, with local pride, isolationism, separatism, with a tendency to reduce complex matters to simple terms and to blur hard edges of historical reality with the gauzy lens of nostalgia. Regional perspectives are seen as a sign of withdrawal, a retreat from problems of race, technological progress, and necessarily national and international views. This critique cannot be dismissed lightly. People have been thinking about this for a long time. There's a work called the Hitopadesa. I hope I pronounce it somewhere close to correctly. It is a collection of Hindu writings dating from around 500 AD. And it lists, along with idleness, women, disorder, discontent, and timidity, a foolish partiality for one's own native place as one of the obstructions to greatness. On the other hand, the different significance that place and regions and regional life have in the contemporary world may not be the result of these sorts of shortcomings or the result of any failure of nerve on our part. E.D. Hirsch, you know, he's the author of the Cultural Literacy, What Every American Should Know. That's almost as popular as The Closing of the American Mind, both of them published this year. He says that localism is constantly being reinvented all over the world, since the large modern national state does not and cannot lend a social glue or emotional meaning to satisfy the human desire for community. And so that would seem to be a perfectly legitimate reason why in our contemporary world we might indeed turn to place. But perfectly intelligent and serious people are nowadays not necessarily going crazy anywhere the ground starts to get uneven. Daniel Patrick Moynihan recently speculated in, of all places, this is an index of how common it's getting, in the Reader's Digest. In the first issue of a Peoples of America series, he speculated that not only group affiliations, but also place has been a factor in determining how immigrants have fared in America. For example, he says the Irish who settled in the industrial North and Middle West have done relatively well in America, while the American Scotch-Irish are, these people have done well because those areas where they settled prospered. While the American Scotch-Irish, he says, are less well educated, hold lower ranking jobs, and have lower incomes because they settled in poorer places like Appalachia. Colleague Andrew Greeley has examined what he thinks is our national illusion, that we are a nation of individuals, and demonstrated that individual achievement measured in terms of education, income, is closely linked to group culture and subculture. Greeley maintains that this relationship between achievement and subculture, minority and ethnic group, is too important to be ignored. And of course, minority and ethnic groups are to be associated with particular areas and places, as Greeley's colleague Morehead suggests in his reference to Appalachia. So in the fields of history and education, literary criticism, economics and religion, the concepts of locality and region, in a word, place, they're becoming worthy of serious attention. In fact, a lack of attention to the concept of region, according to the economist Jane Jacobs, is one of the great intellectual failures of the modern era. And some people are trying to set that right. And I've tried to think about it and become informed about the issues involved here. And I want to show you how this might be put in a poem, in a concluding poem called The Country of Conscience. And I'm just going to dip into it in a place or two. I wrote this poem out of Appalachia for the Russian dissident Solzhenitsyn. Not Solzhenitsyn, but the physicist Sakharov. And took part in a program. I understood that he was being exiled to Gorky. And the fellow told me that Gorky was being exiled from Moscow to Gorky was sort of like being exiled to Detroit. And I got to thinking about that, and so I wrote this poem thinking about not Solzhenitsyn, who's an earlier dissident, but Sakharov. There are two of every country. One country is really there. This side of the river, these mountains. It's a country felt, known. It's a native ground and tongue. There are two of every country, and there are two histories. One history is water flowing quietly for centuries over rock, and stone steps worn smooth by flowing life. It's people living a long time in one place like sycamores along a river. People sinking a well the way a tulip poplar sends down a long taproot. It's a thought spiraling and switching back on itself again and again like a cowpath ascending a hill. A thought making no more noise than a pen scratching on paper. But another history moves on wheels, clanks and creaks and raises clouds of dust, so that a slow-moving village turns like a masked raccoon caught blind in headlights to find itself in the way of a rolling war that crushes its fragile bones. This history calls itself the state. It quarters soldiers in your house. It barbecues your 4-year-old's pet goat. It discovers your horses tethered in the cave and your grandmother's silver in the well. This history hires plainclothes operatives with 2 rolls of fat on the backs of their necks to tiptoe unsubtly up and down corridors of the world, testing doorknobs for any opportunities. This history hires per diem consultants who take war for their metaphor and declare progress. They wage campaigns on target groups in designated sectors. Pray that you're not targeted for some leap forward. Pray that engineers of affluence aren't sent your way, or you may be swept while God is looking the other way, like a sparrow into the church grill of a cruising Cadillac. There are 2 histories. One smells like apples in the cellar, like cedar shavings. The other reeks of ideology that hangs in the brain like turpentine and thinner. There are 2 of every country. There are 2 histories. Histories within history. Nations within empires. A nation is the will to live together. An individual will to differ multiplied. Many agreeing to differ the same way. A will to differ, present in seeds, in cells. Maybe mutation is a will to differ. Dissent, written in microscopic code, a seed harboring a dissident opinion, a refusnik gene with a message that catches on. A majority of one glimpsing the stars cancels the old dogma of mud. There are two of every country. There are two histories. There are two of every man. The man born into the state is only half himself. The nuclear physicist serving the state is only half himself. The other half is his expression, that image of himself and what man is that lives like a sprite in a spring beyond the state's dominion, in the country of conscience, where no rangers of the state patrol, where no federales fly over in helicopters. The state cannot jam broadcasts from the country of conscience, cannot deny you passage there, where the two that you are, man and man's shadow, man and man's image of himself, merge in a single vision. You lie on your stomach at a bold spring, a blue hole nobody knows is there but you, but you've always known, and drink your face. That's a little poem out of Appalachia to Russia. Any responses?
I'm just delighted to be here to speak. I've been concerned about this issue having to do with place identity for more than 25 years. And I want to hasten to add that the length of time I've been possessed by these issues doesn't suggest that I know a whole lot about them. It's just that they're a continual source of fascination and puzzlement to me. At any rate, I'm glad to have a chance to share what I think I know, or at least what I know I think, about place and identity in Appalachia tonight. Also, I'd like to ask a favor of all of you, please, though I was introduced in part as the president of Berea College. That's a happenstance that I can't do much about on this occasion. But I'm really here tonight as a social scientist, and I'm going to try to remember how to be one, and as a student of the Appalachian region, and I hope you will make the appropriate psychological adjustments, please, and accommodate my desire to change roles for just the next few minutes. It seems to me some strange things and noteworthy things are happening. Scottish nationalism is on the rise again. Eskimos and American Indians have organized separately what appear to be OPEC-style organizations, their own cartels within the United States. And twice within the past 3 years, there have been public statements made about the desirability of statehood for parts of Appalachia. If you think there's no connection among these events, you're probably right, but at any rate, I'm about to show you how the mind of this observer sees some connections. My major thesis is that in comparison with the strength of identity, place identity in other regions, regional identity in Appalachia is relatively weak. And beyond that, because future long-term economic, educational, related development should depend on local initiative and native vision, it's imperative that locality-based identity and a political culture and community rooted in such identity become stronger, much stronger. If that vision remains weak, the vacuum will be filled quickly, as it has always been filled in Appalachia by vision and initiative of others. I think education, in the traditional and narrow sense of that word, and the way it's typically promoted, not by itself the answer. The promotion of place-linked identity and the related development of a more vital political culture that relates to place will give rise to significant native vision
effective local initiative and creating local organizations that look to the future of the region. In my opinion, it's likely that broad education for community, county, or other sub-regional development will be more effective than efforts aimed at the region as a whole. I guess I could stop there because that's essentially what I want to say. But I know we'd all be disappointed if I back up and try to give a little argument for these conclusions. 3 years ago, a man named Jim Maggard from Breathitt County, he's a representative in our General Assembly, caught the attention of the state press with an announcement that Eastern Kentucky should secede the Commonwealth of Kentucky. At that time, only $10 million out of roughly $200 million collected by the state in coal taxes was returned to the localities where the coal was being mined. The majority of Kentuckians felt, we presume, that coal was a resource that belonged to the entire Commonwealth, and that tax receipts should be spent wherever the state felt there was a need, resurface the Jefferson Freeway or what have you, Watterson Expressway or whatever. Mr. Maggard held a different view, which was that the coal was a product of certain regions of the state, and that therefore tax funds should be spent to benefit those regions. In the mind of Mr. Maggard, this was not Kentucky coal. It was Eastern or Western Kentucky coal. Some readers may have been startled again recently. Earlier this year, the state newspapers revealed a plan proposed for the creation of a new state made up of several counties from each of 3 adjoining states in the Cumberland Gap area. Anybody see that news story? Too bad. It was fat. You would. This was billed a Chamber of Commerce ploy to promote tourism. But there was nevertheless a kind of a faint echo of the same kind of regional resentment contained in Mr. Maggard's statement of 3 years earlier. One spokesperson, for example, lamented that these counties were largely ignored by their respective states and that they had more in common with each other than they did with their state capitals, which were far removed from them, whether in Virginia, Kentucky, or Tennessee. Mr. Maggard wanted to call his new state East Kentucky, or Cumberland, or just plain Appalachia. And the more recent Chamber of Commerce group down in the Cumberland Gap area, wanted to call their pseudo-state the state of Cumberland. Now, I don't believe Appalachia, that separate statehood for Appalachia is imminent. And I don't think Mr. Maggard really thinks so, or the good people of the Cumberland Gap area. But the fact that several people from this region, one of them an elected official, would express publicly this desire for statehood, I think is interesting at the very least, and maybe significant. It's thought-provoking. It raises certain questions about the existence and the nature and the roots of regional identity. What is it? How is it formed? How does it become a part of the political culture? And what is its relationship to the scholarly study of the region? This announced desire for statehood calls to mind similar regional and ethnic aspirations for separation which have occurred in other parts of the United States and the world. And if you'll bear with me, I want to cite 3 examples that I have a little familiarity with. The case of Native Americans in Alaska, Native Americans in the southwestern United States, and the example of Scotland. No offense to the people who live in the south of Britain. As a consequence, the Eskimos of the North Slope Borough, which is a county of about 80,000 square miles, if you can imagine such a thing, these Eskimos are organized into a very strong, well-heeled economic development association. Although many Eskimos are poor and unemployment is off the map, collectively at least they are rich and they constitute a potent political force. Several tribes of southwestern Indians, more or less about the same time, combined forces to form what is known as the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, or CERT. Their purpose was to further exploitation of individuals and communities and tribes and by external interests in search of coal and gas and uranium and other minerals. And the man who headed this up, and I think he's back in charge of it again after a brief absence, is a person with a full-blooded Navajo with the unlikely name of Peter MacDonald. And Mr. MacDonald's statement was that this was an internal OPEC. They were going to set the terms by which the rest of the people in the United States and the world got access to these minerals and to the oil on Indian land. Now, briefly, the Scots. The history of nationalism in Scotland I find just utterly fascinating. It's a long history, but it was revived in the 1970s when the recovery of North Sea oil began in earnest. And in fact, I find this summer it's being revived again. For those of you who may not recall this bit of history, Scotland joined voluntarily, more or less, with England in an act of union in 1707, Queen Anne's reign. I have to look over here to see if my facts are right, but it's always had this sense of differentness, and many Scots resent the British label. The Scottish Nationalist Party gained so many seats at Westminster in the mid-1970s that their English counterparts arranged for a referendum in Scotland, which, if it had been approved, would have allowed for a new National Assembly in Edinburgh, which would have regulated all internal policies and laws except those pertaining to taxes and armed services. It was narrowly defeated, although it may come back up again at some time in the future. The source of the issue this last time was, interestingly enough, oil. And the SNP, the Scottish National Party, claimed that North Sea oil was Scottish, not British. This may have been a fact of geography, but to date at least it's not become a fact of British politics. Nevertheless, the interesting phenomenon in this case is the strengthening of place-related identity and the political organization that accompanied it. Now, in each of these cases, it's possible to find circumstances that suggest connections among shared identity, mobilization of political sentiment, and action. In each instance, people came together because they shared the same sense of place, they identified place-related issues, and they looked to a shared future together through shared economic and political structures. They had a vision. They saw a place, their place, somewhere, and they worked collectively for its realization. I found it interesting that in each of these cases, a somewhat culturally different people can be identified within a larger social whole, each regarded as marginal by its dominant system, each politically and economically vulnerable to exploitation, and each located geographically on or near a valuable natural resource coveted by powerful outside interests. It's oil in the case of the Eskimos and Scots. It's coal and other minerals in the case of the Southwest Indians. I don't want to draw more from these parallels than I should, but I think they're more than metaphor for each other. I think it's instructive at least to explore them. The only Indian I really know is a man named Vine Deloria, Standing Rock Sioux Indian, who wrote a book once called Custer Died for Your Sins. He made the remark once that the only difference between the Indians and Appalachians was that Appalachians hadn't learned that they live on a reservation. When he said that, I remembered something Harry Caudle had either written or said, and that was that Appalachians live on a pale-faced reservation. Well, as you see, I'm interested in regional identity not just as an interesting subject in itself or for sentimental reasons, but because I think these feelings are sometimes connected to educational, political, economic development activities, and sometimes not. The how and the why of these connections, or the lack of them, is what I find important to think through. And I believe they have direct relevance to the character and quality of life in these mountains. My intention is that place identity is not especially strong in Appalachia, contrary to the conventional wisdom. Let me talk briefly about the nature and sources of place identity. The scholarly literature is almost bare of work on this subject. It is clear, just from common sense observations, that identity related to place varies in strength among different groups, and that it waxes and wanes through time. This variable strength is influenced by such factors as the social context and recent experience. I think most of the time, for most of us, the strength or the valence of place identity is relatively low. That is, we just don't think much about where we're from or where we're located until specific situations call forth. Circumstances have to make where you're from or where you are at that relevant. The reason for that is there's so many other sources of identity operating at any given time, and the valence of these other sources is usually just stronger than place identity. If what we mean by identity is how we answer the question, who am I, then you can see how many different ways it's possible to answer that question. I'm a woman, a child, a teacher, a sick person, a lover of opera, a member of a political party, and so forth. And maybe you'll get around to I live in Rome, or I'm from Morehead, or what have you. The list of possible sources of identity is theoretically, for all practical purposes, infinite. And on relatively few occasions, unless it's called for, we're not going to respond to that question by saying I'm a Midwesterner or I'm an Appalachian.